Welcome, everyone. I appreciate you coming to join us today. It's a beautiful Friday, and you are here in a basement or near your computer to learn about constitutional interpretation and polarization. So thank you for giving us some of your time today. Just a couple housekeeping items. If you haven't already yet, we have these wonderful pocket constitutions available for free. So feel free to grab one and take it as a gift and as a parting prize. We also have a sign-in sheet over there, and if you won't mind signing in, I would appreciate that, just because this helps us keep records for those that support us. At the end of the event, too, we'll be passing out an evaluation for you guys to provide feedback on today, so we can keep improving programming. Finally, this is a Jax Mix event, so if you're working on a Jax Mix micro-credential, at the end of the event, we'll have a QR code that you can scan as a student to earn credit for that event. And we also have some stickers and some pamphlets, so anybody who's interested in learning about our new general education program here on campus is welcome to grab that here too today. The Tocqueville Lecture Series is named after Alexis de Tocqueville. Born of the French aristocracy, Tocqueville examined the world to understand democracy. His investigations convinced him that liberal ideas, which rejected both the antiquity of aristocracy and doubted the promises of the French Revolution, were the progression of history. Whether individuals fought for or against these ideals, he was convinced that equality of conditions is a providential fact. This lecture series invites scholars, professionals, and civic leaders to present on the ideas of liberty and equality as they relate to other concepts important in the founding and continuation of American government. Hosted on the campus of Jacksonville State University, these free lectures are open to the public. We welcome the campus, community, and country to listen, think, reflect, and engage with each other. The Tocqueville Lecture Series is funded by a generous grant from the Jack Miller Center and support from the American Democracy Project at Jacksonville State University. The Jack Miller Center is dedicated to advancing education in America's history, its political and economic institution, and the central principles, ideas, and issues arising from the American and Western traditions, which continue to animate our national life. The American Democracy Project at Jacksonville State University is a non-political, nonpartisan, cooperative effort by students, faculty, staff, and administrators to promote civic engagement. Now, it's a real pleasure because I know you guys have been in suspense since September for this presentation today, for this event. And so nothing like waiting till like near the end of a semester, end of an academic year, to finally deliver on the cliffhanger. So it's my pleasure today to welcome our two guests. Let me just share a little bit about them. Dr. Kimberly Hurd Hale is an associate professor of political science at Coastal Carolina University. She earned her PhD from Louisiana State University. She teaches in the areas of political theory and American politics, and her research includes numerous areas such as modern political thought, American political thought, politics and technology, and politics, literature, and film. I will share that I was first introduced to Kim because her book on Francis Bacon's New Atlantis showed up at the American Political Science Review's office to be reviewed for the journal. Little did they know, we didn't do book reviews at that journal. So any book that came in became the Hunger Games for graduate students. And I quickly said, hands off, this is my book. And proceeded to read it, and then finally got to meet Kim in person and learned, as great as her book is, she's even more amazing in person. She has published numerous works beyond Francis Bacon, including things like Perfection, Technology, and Creation in Literature and Film, and has co-edited books on short stories and political philosophy, as well as political theory on death and dying. I hear the latter is making a killing. Look, you have to have one bad pun. She is also the co-director of the Cincinnati Center at Coastal Carolina University, which is a perfect segue into introducing Dr. Drew Kurlowski. He is an associate professor of political science at Coastal Carolina University and the director of American Studies there. Drew earned his PhD from the University of Missouri, and his teaching interests focus on campaigns and election law, voting behavior, political parties, and American political thought. He's the author of Rules Matter, Elections Laws Revealed, and a chapter in an edited collection concerning the state of political parties. Before joining Coastal Carolina University, Drew was a research assistant at Larry Sabato's Center for Politics at the University of Virginia, a very famous center for forecasting elections in the nation. And he was a senior research fellow at a DC voter targeting firm. In other words, he's actually engaged in the things that we study in political science. Not all of us always do that. He actually has done the thing. He now serves as a polling coordinator for the Dyer Institute for Leadership and Public Policy, and he is the co-director of the Cincinnati Center at Coastal Carolina University, which mission is to study, discuss, and promote civic education, civic virtue, and traditions of political and economic thought. Please join me in welcoming our guest today. Kim, the podium is yours.
Hello, everyone. So again, thank you all for coming out on a Friday afternoon. It's lovely weather here, and so we really appreciate your interest in learning about constitutional interpretation. Today's event, we're going to offer two different models of constitutional interpretation, originalism and the living constitution. I'll be giving a brief introduction to originalism, then Drew will be discussing the living constitution, and then we'll discuss the strengths and weaknesses of each and hopefully have a really rigorous, productive discussion about how to reconcile these two competing models, or at least help them to coexist peacefully. And so, given the task of introducing originalism is a little bit daunting because it does have what I think is an undeservedly negative reputation in political discourse. So my defense of originalism is going to take two prongs, one philosophical, the other, we'll say, practical. And so philosophically, the idea of originalism as a method of constitutional interpretation relies on the idea that we should venerate the Constitution as a sacred document. Now, the idea of needing a sacred document, particularly a sacred founding document, has its roots thousands of years of political philosophy, going back to Aristotle, but really kind of articulated most clearly by Rousseau with his idea of the necessity of a civil religion. Right, so if you don't want to actually have a state-sponsored religion, a sacred constitution is in many ways a good substitute. The thinking behind this is that any form of popular government, whether it be a republic or a democracy, is going to be marked by discord, by faction, by disagreements amongst the citizens and disagreements between the public and the government. And so there needs to be something that will hold the country together, that hold the society together when these serious disagreements do erupt, that we're going to need to have something to look back towards to say this is the foundation of our country and these are the hard, bright lines that we do not cross. And so the Constitution serves this role in American political thought. We adopt a written constitution for a reason. I'll get to that more in a second. And then we do prioritize keeping the Constitution short and making it difficult to amend. Because as you guys can all tell if you've picked up your pocket constitution on the way in, there is value to having a constitution that every citizen can reasonably be expected to read and to remember and to know what the contents are. And so this is going to be the value, again, of the written constitution. So originalism as a method of judicial interpretation does require a lot of the person attempting to practice it. It is not just a veneration of the text of the Constitution itself, though that is a huge part of it. However, anybody who has ever read a book, particularly an older book, knows words do change their meanings, right? And words are ambiguous. Every single word of the English language, I would argue, might have different connotations or different meanings or different, emphases depending on the context in which it is uttered. And so there's always going to be some sort of interpretation that goes on, even in the strictest originalist interpretation of the Constitution. Originalists simply argue that this interpretation needs to be kept as narrow as possible, that there needs to be a serious attempt to understand what the intent of the framers of the Constitution meant. So to do that, you do draw on the text of the Constitution itself, but you also are required to go and study the primary source documents from the time of the framing, from the Constitutional Convention, from the state ratifying debates, from the framers' own writings and other contexts. You have to read all of that. Then you also have to go back and read the thinkers that were influencing the framers of the Constitution. You need to have at least working knowledge of Enlightenment political philosophy, for example. You need to know what these terms mean. You need to know how these ideas were interpreted in the popular discourse of not just the United States, but also England at this time. You need to look at state constitutions and see, how the different states were interpreting ideas like executive power or freedom of religion. What do these things actually mean? And so this is a process that, again, requires a high level of education, but also a lot of time. It requires a lot of effort. And this is done purposefully. So to move from the philosophical argument for originalism to the practical one, the very fact that an originalist interpretation of the Constitution requires so much time and effort does mean that the Constitution will not be amended lightly. If you have to undertake perhaps a years-long study of, for example, what it means to say a person has executive power before you can interpret what Article 2 of the Constitution means in a particular case, then it's going to be the case that you're going to really have a rigorous understanding of what that Constitution meant, but also you're not going to lightly change it because you will have spent a lot of time and effort and energy into figuring out what it meant originally. Now, Antonin Scalia, probably our most famous advocate of originalism, argued that originalism is not just the superior method of interpretation philosophically, but that it is the legally superior framework because we have in fact adopted a written constitution. If a society's constitution remains unwritten, for example, the way that Great Britain's is, then it is up to the legislator to determine if a law is in line with the Constitution or not. The Constitution can evolve freely because there is nothing foundational about it. There is nothing that holds it to an original document. There's nothing that gives it the character of law. But by framing a written constitution, that gives the Constitution the character of law in the United States. And so there has to be, whenever two laws conflict, there has to be a study about which law is going to prevail. Two conflicting laws cannot be permitted to coexist in any functional society. And the Constitution has to be the fundamental law of the land. It has to be the supreme law. And so this is going to give the court the power to strike down lesser laws. But again, this should not be done lightly. That originalists argue that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, but that any sort of lesser law should be the province of the legislators. That if the public demands a change to the Constitution, because it is of course true that our values change, that our information changes, our society changes over time, the proper correction to that is constitutional amendment through the process outlined in the Constitution itself. It is not a radical reinterpretation of the words of the Constitution. You cannot simply decide that the Constitution means something new simply because we want it to mean something new. Instead, because we are a democracy or a republic, we need to abide by the legally thought out written process for acknowledging that the fundamental values of our society have changed. And the proper way to do this is through amending the Constitution. Otherwise, we are in fact negating our public responsibility to figure out what our values are and insist that our legislators abide by them. We are allowing the court, very small, unelected group of people, to dictate what the fundamental values of our society are. And this is anathema to the Republican principle. This is anathema to the idea of popular government itself. If our values as a society have changed, we have to demand that our Constitution changes along with them, rather than allowing for this piecemeal reinterpretation of a document that does, in fact, have real meaning. All right, so that is my piece. Thank you.
Everyone hear me? I'm on. All right. Thank you, Kim, for introducing the topic at hand and having to take a first crack at it. I'll try not to levy too many criticisms against the things that you've said and respond right now. That's something that maybe we can get into. But my colleague has taken us back to 1787, and I think she suggests I think a very narrow method for looking at our Constitution that I don't think that I would disagree that we need to remain anchored to the Constitution, but I think it's an entirely other matter to become frozen in time. And I don't think that's what the founders meant at the time either. So I'm here to introduce this method of interpreting the Constitution as a living document. And I'll take you maybe through 4 or 5 steps that I think an interpreter, a justice on the court might engage in. And I'd like to give a couple of arguments for why I believe it's superior, and then pose a couple of questions about the utility of originalism. So in looking at the Constitution and interpreting the document through the framework of a living Constitution, we're still looking at the text, right? I think it's important to understand that a living constitutionalist is not throwing out the plain meaning, the original meaning, the unambiguous meaning of a document. And I think it's important to note that in many cases, I think Kim and I will find ourselves at the same conclusion, even with differing methods, because there are places in the Constitution that are simply unambiguous. What we're talking about are these times where we're in the margins, right? Where there is ambiguity, and when the text doesn't offer us anything else. I think there are things that we can look at within the historical context, but I don't think that should be a dominant reading or a dominant place of looking. I think what we need to do instead is to think about our contemporary understandings. When we look at the legal system today and we think about what words mean, when we look at a contract and think about what's within the 4 corners of that document, we're not looking at language as it was understood in 1787. When a document today, a legal document, talks about a person, we understand it to mean men and women. It would be silly to think about interpreting our Constitution as something that only meant men when it says persons. So we want to think that we want to think about bringing contemporary understandings of language when we're looking at the Constitution to match the language that we use in our legal system. Obviously, we're also going to be constrained by precedent, by practical concerns, right? But what makes the living constitutionalist different from the originalist is that we're thinking about moral, social, and pragmatic concerns in ways that they are not. We're trying to remain faithful to core principles, but be flexible and open to change. And I want to argue there are 3 reasons why this method is superior. And the first is that it helps us to maintain relevance. It helps the document to maintain relevance. My colleague talks quite a bit about venerating the document, but it's difficult to venerate something that has become obsolete or something that cannot speak to current problems. The idea of having a document that lives and evolves with us is what helps it to remain useful. Thomas Jefferson has a great quote about the idea of the silliness of being ruled or governed by the laws of our ancestors as being as silly as a grown man trying to wear the coat that he wore as a child, right? The living Constitution framework allows that jacket to be retailored to fit us as grown adults. We'll bear the metaphor with me. There's also a necessity in doing this, that I respect the work that Dr. Hale talks about in thinking about state ratifying conventions, the conventions themselves, the Philadelphia Convention, the personal correspondence of the founders. And indeed, this is quite a bit of work, right? But there is a necessity of finding other sources to help us to understand the Constitution when those founding sources come up short. The vagaries of the language of the Constitution, the simple silence on many matters related to modernity. I know I see some students, I don't know what Jacksonville State has done with TikTok, but TikTok has been a big thing on our campus. We've had some state laws about whether or not you can ban TikTok from state-owned servers. I don't believe that Madison or Hamilton contemplated a TikTok or an internet or cell phones or the ownership of a company like this by a foreign nation. We have to look elsewhere. There will be nothing that we can do, no documents that we can find, no depth to which we can probe that will tell us what we should do with TikTok. Right? So I think there's a necessity there. This is a second. The third, I think, is that there's a historical foundation for this. Madison, although he is probably Kim's staunchest ally, Madison writes in some private correspondence that he does not think that the records that he had painstakingly taken at the Philadelphia Convention should be used as a way to think about what the Constitution means. That's why he kept them to himself until he had passed away. It's also not clear that originalists can find one true meaning amongst all of these founders who have incredibly different ideologies, incredibly different thoughts. I mean, we talk right now about Jefferson's thought about the jacket and Madison's thought about veneration. And then how do we reconcile the two views of these very different founders into originalism? And if there is not one single understanding to be found at that core, then it seems like we're also going to be interjecting some of our own thoughts into originalism just as well. I think that would be one of my primary concerns or criticisms of originalism, is that it purports to be this method which provides for judicial restraint and allows us to not move so quickly, that allows us to maintain a veneration of our texts. But I think it falls a little bit short in that it is entirely unlimiting to justices in terms of which historical documents they rely on, which particular founders they rely on. And I'm not so sure that in the end result, originalism is all that different from a living constitutional interpretation. It's just that we're looking at some different criteria, and where my colleague Kim would probably want to fall back on historical understandings. I think that the living constitutionalist would think about things like justice and fairness and human dignity, and thinking about how we can continue to have this document maintain relevance in our lives today. I'll make a final note, again, just to sort of think about one of the things that Dr. Hale said, is the idea that these unelected justices ought not be inserting their own opinions and legislating from the bench, what have you. And I think that democracies are similarly imperfect. And I'm not sure that we had a conversation with the class today whether or not we would trust our current Congress to draft a new constitution, whether or not even absent the capability, there is the wherewithal of the Congress to pay attention to the needs of constitutional reinvigoration. That when push comes to shove and we actually do get some movement, as we did during the 1970s with the Equal Rights Amendment, to explicitly take care of some of these rules these problems with the 14th Amendment and the use of the word persons, and whether or not person includes woman in terms of equal rights protections. We couldn't do it. We did not have the political capacity nationwide to pass an amendment to say that women were equal and were persons under that Constitution. So I think our democracies are similarly imperfect, and we can't simply sit by and allow that imperfection to render the document obsolete. And I think that having capable and well-read and learned justices who are not entirely unaccountable. We do have impeachment proceedings. They are nominated and confirmed by the other two branches. Right? Let's not think of them as a totally isolated branch, but to have them in some of that considered judgment and in some of their own training, right, as opposed to our very untrained Congress, to do some of this work of weighing and measuring. I think that is a much better solution to. I think I'm getting staticky about changing times. Right? So that's my take on the living Constitution and why we should continue to update our understanding of the Constitution to fit with modern times. Okay. I'm still on.
Yep. I think we're. Yeah. No, I don't. I think we're all on. Yeah. So before we hand it off to the audience for a couple questions, I have a couple for us. So help me out. Is originalism and the living Constitution just ideological frameworks, or are they something else? Is originalism just another word for conservatism and the living Constitution just another word for progressivism, or are they some other type of framework than just ideology?
I would probably accept the I would accept the conclusion that to a certain extent the living constitutionalism is a form of progressivism. I think that's inherent in the method, right? That we are trying to progress the document. We are trying to update it. I don't think it's completely an ideology in the sense that it is purely ideological. As I mentioned, I think there are other things that we still have to keep in mind. We do have to look at the text. We are still constrained by words. I mean, I don't want to get feisty with you yet, but you talked about radically rewriting. Yeah. I mean, suggesting that persons means men and women instead of just men is not radical, or it's not I mean, we're still limited by, to some degree, the text, the words, the meaning, by the principles or the values embodied in the document. So I don't think it's entirely ideological in that sense, but I would say it is definitely progressive as we try to progress the document forward. I don't know that I would say the same thing about originalism.
Yeah, so I think that I completely agree on this point, that one of
We're already agreeing.
So the one thing that we do have to contend with is the idea that there is no conservatism as an ideology, right? Capital P progressivism, is a ideological movement of the early 20th century that is explicitly anti-foundational. That with thinkers like John Dewey calling for, again, not to use the word radical too many times, but radical experimentation in political science. Like, get rid of the Constitution, get rid of all these things that are holding us back, because we now possess enough, information, enough, scientific methodology to actually really progress, to make genuine progress towards something better. And all of these things are just holding us back. That is an ideological framework that I agree. I think the living constitutional model fits right into, because it is this idea that, each generation will have better knowledge than the previous generation. And so, of course, why wouldn't we make use of that? On the other hand, there is no such thing as capital C conservatism. Like, conservatism is a wide array of smaller factions that really fundamentally disagree with each other all of the time. And so you can say that originalism is conservative in its approach. I think that's absolutely fair. I don't think you can say it's an ideology in the same way just because there is no such thing as conservative ideology.
I mean, but you have frozen our values at 1784. I mean, or 1789. Yeah. Would you say that you can impute into the Constitution are the ones that existed in 1789?
No, because you can amend the Constitution.
At the time of the amending of the Constitution.
Yeah. So every time the Constitution is amended, it is an acknowledgement of the update.
So we have to read the 14th Amendment and the only values we can impute are those that were in play in 1868.
I think so, yeah. I think, and again, what those values actually are is, of course, an incredibly difficult thing to determine. Because again, if we even go back to just kind of original text of the Constitution, I'm fine with John Locke's values being my values, right? Like John Locke supports equality between men and women. He opposes slavery, supports republicanism over monarchy, supports free trade for the most part. Like I'm fine with all of that. And so yeah. But then again, if we were going to somebody like Jefferson, I am not fine with Jefferson's values being my values. And so there is, again, of course, this massive undertaking to figure out what values we're actually talking about when we're talking about the fundamental values of the Constitution. Are they Madison's because he wrote, a lot of it, or are they Locke's because he inspired the entire thing? So this isn't, again, a weakness of originalism, right? Like whose values are you cherry picking when you're talking about
when you pick
the
them,
old ones? Yeah,
perhaps.
Yeah.
Are you not imputing your own values
Yeah.
there?
Yeah, I think that absolutely you're right about that. Yeah, but I think that there is a consensus can be drawn about what the values of the Constitution are if we make the concerted effort to educate ourselves. And I don't think that they are necessarily incompatible with what we would want now.
What happens when these principles are in conflict with each other? Because we have multiple principles in American government. So, for example, this lecture series is dedicated to liberty and equality. We may want both the individual person to have freedom to practice their religious faith, but we also may want every person to have the equal opportunity to buy a wedding cake. This is a famous, Supreme Court case, for those that don't know, that was recently decided in our lifetime. How does your constitutional interpretation help us to resolve conflicts that arise at this principle level of American government?
Yeah, I think you're
reconcile this thing. Masterpiece Cake Shop. I mean, I look to those fundamental values of justice and fairness and say, yeah, you bake the cake.
I look to the fundamental values of liberty, saying you don't have to bake a cake if you don't want to. I mean, this is a problem not of constitutional interpretation. It's a problem of democracy, right? That we do have two fundamental principles of American democracy that are equality and liberty, and they don't often go together. They are in serious conflict a lot of the time. And so this process of working out which is more important is like the democratic process. Yeah, I think. Yeah.
And so would you be fair to say then maybe perhaps that the originalist position leaves that working out more to be done by the people, where the living Constitution sees more of an active role for the judiciary in working that out?
Yeah, I think that's probably. The Constitution cannot answer these new questions without either, right, the democratic process through constitutional amendment changing it, or the judiciary through justices interpreting it and making a call, right? It's simply not up to the task of a lot of questions related to modernity and technology and things like this. It's incapable. So I think, yeah, that's the call. Do you trust, or is it possible in our current political environment to do the work to change the document?
So I also do think originalism is a superior model given the volatility of things like technology. If we updated our Constitution every time there was a new technological development, it would be chaos. We would be trying to change the Constitution every 6 months. Technology just progresses too quickly. The Constitution is not equipped to rise to these kinds of challenges. It needs to be statute law. It needs to be the legislator who, ideally would be in touch with the people and can design laws under the broad framework of the Constitution that don't necessarily conflict with the Constitution, but that don't require us to reinterpret the Constitution itself, that just, can adapt to changing times without us needing to actually resort to reinterpretation of the Constitution. That would be my position, at least.
I don't know. you think about,
Mhm.
are we not? Is folder a a paper
Mhm.
in the sense of the Fourth Amendment that is protected from unreasonable search and
Mhm.
seizure, right? Now we have to change the Constitution before that's protected, or we say it's reasonable to think that a digital document is a paper.
I think that as long as we have put in a serious effort to figure out, what is the nature of communication, right? Like, is it a paper or is it a communication? Then again, some narrow interpretation is always going to be necessary. Like, yes, the text of the Constitution itself is not going to ever be sufficient. But I do think that we need to be careful about what we include in these terms that have become ambiguous.
Do you guys have any ethical concerns about each other's positions? And are these ethical concerns different at all from your political concerns about your positions?
I mean, I think about some of the most landmark
Mhm.
cases of the last 100 years that deal with the flourishing of people in our society, and I think that those decisions are fundamentally incompatible with the concept of originalism. If you're an originalist, you cannot come to the conclusion that the court came to in Brown versus Board. I cannot morally accept a philosophy or a framework of constitutional interpretation that would not allow for Brown versus Board, right? That would not allow for Griswold versus Connecticut, which would not allow for, Obergefell versus Hodges. These cases that I think are these landmark cases. I mean, I don't think that I can on a moral basis, right? Regardless of maybe of a political concern.
So our moral conclusions are the same. I am very leery of using the court to get us these rights for the very reason that it does make them subject to being overturned, right? So if we think about privacy, I very much want there to be a right to privacy. And I think allowing the court to establish a right to privacy through Griswold and through Lawrence, it means that it's always going to be the possibility that this right gets taken away because the court can decide to overturn precedent. Whereas if it is guaranteed to us through the process of constitutional amendment, then it becomes extraordinarily more difficult for that right to be taken away. As we know, we've only overturned one constitutional amendment, and it was the only progressive era constitutional amendment, prohibition. And so this, I think, lends itself well to the originalist argument, which, again, if we think about it as coeval with conservatism, I think does it a disservice. But if you think about the rights that we really want to ensure are enshrined in our society, we want to go through the trouble of building it into the Constitution because the democracy is fickle. We can elect new legislators that are going to overturn statute law. We can elect presidents and senates that are going to appoint justices that are perfectly willing to overturn precedent. And so, we thought that, not to get super controversial immediately, that Roe was settled law for generations. No, it's not. So, I mean, I think that relying on the court to give us the rights that we want because of our evolving society, that is ethically shaky, I think, and it's morally dangerous as well.
When would we have gotten there with Brown?
I don't know. I mean, I can't.
Right.
I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, I find it difficult because I think sometimes we are, again, expanding the scope to apply to previously marginalized groups that do not have voice in the political system and are dealing with an oppression or a tyranny of the majority to where there are no democratic mechanisms for change. And I do find it a little disingenuous sometimes, to my area of voting, for example. Let's take the Voting Rights Act, recently invalidated under Shelby, right? And then you go and look and you say, well, you've got conservative originalist justices going back to the 14th Amendment saying, well, you have to treat these states equally because there's no understanding at the time that you can treat states unevenly. That's nonsense. Alabama is under a military, military occupation at the time. The states are being treated differently in 1868, right? These are military districts being governed by generals. I think there's absolutely that precedent. And the democratic process here has said, we want to have the Voting Rights Act because we need to secure voting rights. And the Supreme Court, conservatism couched in originalism says, no, we're not going to do that anymore.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Too controversial. Yeah, that's right. That's right. I guess one thing is, what does leadership look like on the Supreme Court? And given your constitutional interpretations and given the polarization that exists, can we look to the Supreme Court to be in a leadership position?
A handful of years ago, perhaps. I don't know that the capital is there. I don't know that the public respect for the institution, the deference, I don't know that it's there. I don't know that they have been taking care of the institutional housekeeping that's necessary to maintain that tenuous power that they have, right? As the least dangerous branch. You go back to Marbury, right? There's a reason why Marshall says we don't have to give the commission, because he's not going to tell Jefferson to do something because he doesn't think he has the power to do it. And I think that the court in recent years maybe that has really lost that perception that they had of being elevated, of requiring or demanding deference. So I'm not sure they have the capacity to lead on the national political stage at this moment.
I agree with that. And I think that it is related to this question of interpretation, though, because I think for several decades at this point, most Americans do not consider a law to be a real law until it's challenged before the court, which means that the court was inevitably going to be seen as a political body, not as a judicial body, right? That they were not going to ever be able to maintain this perceived neutrality or kind of objectivity if they are regularly being asked to weigh in on political questions. And so I do think it might be a mistake to say that the court was ever not political. Of course they're political, but the public perception of the court is now that they are just one more partisan body that is divided and they're no better than the Senate, right? Like that is kind of the public perception at this point, at least, from the students that I talked to. And so, under those circumstances, I don't think they can lead in the same way that we would hope that they were able to lead in previous eras where it really was the case that, as Scalia talks about, like Taft spending 3 years coming to an understanding of what executive power means in the Myers decision. We don't let the court do that now. And if they were to declare their intent to do so, most people would see it as some sort of conspiracy, right? Like it wouldn't be seen as the best legal minds in our country actually making an effort to do their job. It would be seen in many ways as like them abdicating responsibility because we want the court to rule right now and like settle this and be on our side. And it's very political at this point in the bad way.
Right.
Yeah.
I'd agree with that. We're validation of the political process that's taken place, and this is what I meant when I said I think democracy is imperfect as well, and that's probably quickened or heightened by partisan polarization. We're unwilling to lose in the democratic process, and so everything has to be challenged.
Yeah.
So if I was just an average person, not a political scientist, not a political science major, but just a citizen, what do I leave today's event with to help make a responsible decision about how I should be figuring out how I should determine which position is more reasonable to me or how I should be interpreting the Constitution? What advice can we give to just an average citizen about how to engage in this thought between these two positions?
I mean, I think that, again, it is not unreasonable to ask informed citizens of a republic or democracy to read the Constitution and to read Supreme Court decisions, right? Like, they issue majority opinions and dissenting opinions. Actually read them, figure out why the court made the decision that they made, because it is simply untrue that there is, for the most part, a conservative justice and a liberal justice, and they will always, be partisan in their decisions. Of course, their kind of philosophical orientation or their ideological framework will necessarily inform how they tend to rule, but it is important to actually see what the thinking is, about what their reasoning is, and then, again, go back from there and start to figure out, is this valid, right? Like, we have to figure out, there is a difference between this is a logically valid way to reason and I agree with this conclusion, right? Like, those can be separate things. But if you can actually understand how a person is thinking and what they are drawing from to make a decision, then I think that goes a long way towards restoring trust in the court and trusting our own ability as citizens to figure out what our fundamental values are, and hopefully at that point start to demand better of our legislator and demand better of our governors, and make them do their job and not just defer to the court.
Yeah. I also think we need to remember, and I mentioned this earlier, that a lot of this disagreement happens at the margins.
Mm-hmm.
And you look back at the last couple of terms of court, and around 50% of the decisions are unanimous, right? That the law might be ambiguous, or it might need, it's an appeal that just needs another look, but there are not the massive distinctions, and I think, unfortunately, politicization of the most, these six, well, now they're 6-3 or 5-4, which only make up, or, maybe 8 to 12 cases in a given term out of 80 or so. I mean, that's a small minority of the work that the court is doing, but no one pays attention to the remainder, which is uncontroversial and where the judiciary functions at a pretty high level, right? I mean, they're doing the work of that. They're interpreting the law. They're settling disputes. They're handling this. But then you get to these hot button issues, which, again, I think we're punting, right, to the courts on that, because they have the political insulation it's necessary to make difficult decisions. But I do think that we probably have a perception of the divide amongst the justices that is exceptionally. And I think you only need to look, for example, to some of the interpersonal dynamics that we've seen when you heard about the friendships that existed between members of the court who were on other side, opposing sides of the ideological spectrum. That it is a fairly collegial court.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that is referring to Scalia and Ginsburg, who were very, very close friends for most of their lives, but looking at the public perception of that friendship is important as well, because while I think political scientists look to it very hopefully, saying like, oh, see, it is still a collegial body, a lot of, let's say, ordinary citizens view it as a betrayal on both sides. That how could Ginsburg be friends with Scalia? How could Scalia be friends with Ginsburg? Never mind, of course, they have or had way more in common with each other than either of them would have with anybody except for a handful of people in history. Like, being a Supreme Court justice is a fairly unique experience, but it is perceived as a betrayal of the partisanship, of the partisan faction. And I think that that's problematic, like very, very problematic.
Mm-hmm. But I do think that tells you how, because how you can, they can totally have, and I don't think they're different on a lot of these cases. Mm-hmm. I don't think that they're, they might be using a different lens for the analysis, but the conclusion is the same. Yeah. They're happy to be at the same place. They've done a good day's work. They go home. Mm-hmm. That's where you find the friendship or the connection. The animosity is on the front steps. Mm-hmm. I was up to DC last. It's being heard, and there's a barrier down the middle and two people on podiums that are shouting about two sides of their issue, right? It's not what's happening inside the court. But because that's what's on the front steps, that's our perception of what's happening in the court. Mm-hmm.
So what's the role of civic education then in all this? Because what I'm hearing from you guys right now is a breakdown between perception and reality And so what does civic education have to perhaps do with this? And what does civic education look like, given that you guys have different frameworks of how the court should function?
So I think that the way I always phrase it to my students is that learning to be a good citizen of a republic or democracy is extraordinarily difficult, because it's not just about attempting to persuade your fellow citizens about the correctness of your position. It's also being willing and able to be persuaded when you hear a superior argument. And that's, I think, the part we struggle with the most, right? And so I think modeling, debate or discourse in, a low stakes environment like a classroom, it's, again, fairly low stakes like a classroom. You might make somebody angry, you're not going to be arrested. But I think that this helps students where they can say, like practice figuring out why they believe what they believe, why they take the positions that they take, but then also like figuring out, well, no, like this person actually made a good point, and I can see where they're coming from. And even if they end up not, wholly changing their own position, to say, well, actually, it is possible to disagree and still coexist and still be productive citizens or next to each other, if not together. Yeah, so that's where I kind of fall on this.
The best point you made, Kim, was that I think about the necessity and of having a document that you can revere. Mm-hmm. Okay, now your turn.
You are right that the framers did not know what TikTok was.
Boo. Yeah, I do think, though, we overemphasize division, and we underemphasize the core values that I think the living constitutionalist would on their own attempt to impute into the meaning. For the living constitutionalist, it's not about necessarily fundamentally different values than those that are espoused in the Constitution. It's about finding ways to expand them, right? Or finding ways to apply those same values to new and novel situations that had not been contemplated before. But we don't highlight the fact that we are on the same page with, a constellation of probably about 5 or 6 fundamental values. And I think that's problematic.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it is really important to kind of be clear that, again, some of those fundamental values do conflict with one another. That my favorite quote from Federalist 51 from Madison says, "Justice is the end of government, and it should be pursued until it's obtained or until liberty is lost in the process." Right? Like that's a really scary quote, and that it's really important to American political thought, because it's articulating that justice and liberty are not often compatible. That in order to have a just society, you have to restrict liberty. But of course, if you restrict liberty too much in the pursuit of justice, then you are going to be living in a tyranny. So trying to figure out like what level of injustice you can tolerate in order to keep a free society, that's not pleasant, right? Like that's not fun, but it is necessary. And it's something that I think we all struggle with. Like if you ask students, like, do you think liberty or equality is more important? They say yes. Like they say, I want both. And so getting students to understand, necessarily that you can't have everything. You are going to have to compromise, and figuring out where you can safely compromise is going to be really difficult. And it's going to require a lot of very careful thought and conversation. But it is something we all have to do if we want to keep our republic.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue to end the tyranny of my questions, and the segue into the 1980s talk show moment where I go around and take the questions from the audience. So of course, our online audience too, feel free to submit your questions online. I'll periodically come here and check the computer, but I'm going to open it up now. If anyone has a question, I'll come with the mic. And, I'll hand it over. So my goodness, the phone lines are open. Donations, I guess.
Take donations.
I'm going to cheat because I got 2 questions and I'm going to ask them both. Why do you think the Constitution hasn't been amended in such a long time? Number 1. Number 2, both of your thank you, both for your comments on both of your positions. I find the debate really good and important. I think I join a lot of Americans right now about being very wary of the presence of money and capitalism in our politics and in our Constitution. And I'd like you to kind of talk a little bit about the relationship of money with your positions as well. So 2 questions. Thank you.
Yes, we talked about two reasons.
Mhm.
So that I think are
For
for the first question.
Yeah.
So my reason, I said that I think, when we look back at previously successful amendments, that we were perhaps at times there was more widespread public support for those things, and particularly with respect to rights, sort of speak, as you expand those rights out, it's sort of like the change from fundamental civil liberties to civil rights, and there becomes at least I think within our framework of the classical liberal tradition, there becomes less support when civil liberties begin to look like civil rights, when we begin to talk more about the equality of opportunities than equality from government treatment. So I do think that there's a fundamental change in the amount of public support for some of these things. And I think, again, the Equal Rights Amendment in the 70s is a great example of how this seems a fairly cut and dry case. We want to treat women the same as we treat men, and there's not enough public support to get that through. I can't imagine the political capital needed to get something even more controversial into today. If we talk about other marginalized groups or other groups whose rights might be threatened, to talk about how we can get a constitutional amendment to protect those folks. And then the other was
too much information.
Too much information.
Yeah, that
the sausage making.
Yeah, that in previous eras, it was the case that for all of the very bad problems that are associated with a group of men in a room making all the decisions, it was possible for legislators and constitutional conventions to meet and decide these things amongst themselves before the public really knew what was going on, or there's a limited amount of feedback that they're getting from the public during these efforts to amend the Constitution. Currently, and for the past couple of decades, it's going to be on C-SPAN, right? It's going to be on Twitter now. It's going to be instant, divisive flood of feedback anytime there would attempt to be any sort of movement on a constitutional amendment. And I do think it is just beyond the capacity of most of our political leaders to withstand that kind of onslaught and take a position that would be, career-ending. That's even if they believe it's the right thing to do. It's a lot to ask of a person.
The supermajoritarian principle will require people to anger their constituents in ways that they are probably not comfortable doing.
Yeah.
To your second point, you'll have to ask the originalist why they decided that corporations should be able to spend money like people. I'm not sure how they got to that.
That's not an originalist position. That's a conservative position.
Yet all of your originalists found that position in Citizens United. So,
but
and don't forget, Kim and I are modeling, I think, extreme versions of our own points here.
Yes, we are.
For the sake of the debate.
I do not believe that corporations are people. But yes. So I don't have a good answer to that. I think that's a failure of originalism. And I think that, and this is something, again, even Scalia, our most ardent originalist, says repeatedly, originalism is not being practiced by originalists. He said that they're the worst of both worlds. They want it to just be, as Drew was pointing out, they want it to just be conservatism. And he said, that's not what it is. It is actually this really arduous effort to educate yourself about the fundamental principles and philosophical traditions that influence the American political tradition. And he said, that's different from just saying keep things the way they used to be, or do whatever is going to be popular amongst conservative constituents at the time. And so he's a huge critic of, not a critic of that decision, but he's a critic of, all of these originalists who do, he says, take the worst of both possible approaches. And so I can't defend Citizens United. It's not an originalist decision. Yeah. It's a conservative decision.
Yeah, I think too, when you get, and I think an originalist would say that, levels of scrutiny or things like that are not originalist either. But you get to these points where you have to weigh, the compelling government interest in preventing corruption in elections with that First Amendment right to speech. And even an originalist will have to use some sort of a value to reconcile that weighting of whether or not there is a compelling government interest in overriding that First Amendment right. And again, and this is one of my critiques, is that ends up looking a whole lot like what the living constitutionalist is accused of doing, right? Imputing your own values. But I don't think you would be hard pressed to find many people who would disagree with your assumption or with your statement that money in politics has been a bad thing or has deleterious effects.
I mean, I'll say, yeah.
But we do spend more money on like cheeseburgers than we spend on politics.
I mean, I do think it's vastly superior to the alternative, with only state-funded elections. That is a recipe for tyranny, right? Like, so that is, I think, absolutely a more dangerous alternative. There is no good alternative between, kind of unfettered money in politics and tightly restricting who gets to participate in the electoral process based on approval by a government agency. I'm very uncomfortable. I would be very uncomfortable with that.
Well, thank you all for being here. It's been a very good discussion. I took 3 pages of notes. So there'll be a quiz afterwards. I would just say that I feel like money is like water, and it's going to be attracted to power. And whatever dam you put up, if there's power, money is going to find its way there. But my question is, when did this sort of living interpretation start to come about? As a historian, I'm sort of interested when this divide in the interpretation started to emerge, and was there a different interpretation prior? I'm going to say that the originalist was around for a long time. I'm assuming that, and that the living interpretation came later. I'm sort of interested in the historic dynamic of that and its emergence.
Jefferson's a living constitutionalist.
I think that both are present at the founding, which is one of my concerns, that if the founders are not monolithically originalists, then how can we say that we must be originalists?
Although I think, and you
more of them probably were.
Yeah, I think you made this distinction earlier, and it's really useful though to distinguish between founders and framers, because Jefferson is not a framer.
Yeah,
he was not at the convention. He did not understand how hard it was to get this Constitution, approved, and so I think that, in my opinion, Jefferson is a suspect actor in this entire debate. Is it Jim Caesar that says that he wants? Jefferson wants a living constitution because then he becomes the only founder that matters, because he wrote the Declaration. I don't think that's true, but it's a fun conspiracy theory.
Hey, welcome to Jacksonville State. There's a new top. Pauline kicks in. 2 things. To Dr. Hurd Hale, I would caution you on requiring amendment for everything. If you look at the state of Alabama's constitution, you will see the problems of that. So use caution. I'm wondering if there is, you've both put this in 2 frameworks, and in the back of my mind, there's a third that can combine these frameworks that would probably get us closer to the truth or to reality. And have you, either one of you, thought of, maybe there's a third option here, a combination of the 2 frameworks?
So stare decisis is the compromise, and I think it is detested by both living constitutionalists and originalists, right? So stare decisis, let the decision stand, is the process of allowing previous interpretations of the Constitution to stand as a settled law until they don't, until we suddenly change the way that we interpret this. And I think that this does combine the worst impulses of both frameworks, because it does not actually give us a solid foundation that the originalists want us to have in terms of constitutional veneration. And it also does not allow us to, or require us to actively work out in real time what we want the Constitution to be, which would be like the best model of the living Constitution. And so, yeah, there is a third way, but I think it's the worst of the three ways in many ways.
It would involve a lot more
Yeah.
of the unknown. I do think that you can temper a living constitutionalist framework, or let's say we can weight it with a larger respect or weight for original text and intent, and then only begin to impute the values or update language when there are unambiguities or ambiguities or something like that. So I think you could have flavors of living constitutionalism that pay more or less deference to original meaning. I don't think you can compromise within, again, like when Scalia talks about the true form of originalism, I don't think there is room to temper that.
Yeah, there's not.
Or again, I think you get bad outcomes.
I think, well, it's the process of studying these things is just so ambiguous. And, we've talked about this before, that if we look at what does person mean to the framers of the Constitution? Well, that depends on which founder you're talking to, and that depends on which philosophical tradition they're drawing from, because for John Locke, person absolutely means human being. If you're talking about like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, man means men, right? But person means men, or the other, like when Locke says man, he means mankind, right? Like he means humanity. So it is, and again, this is both a kind of vulnerability of originalism, but also a strength of originalism, where if you actually take the time to study all these things, you see, again, like a lot of these supposed conflicts are not really there is basis in the original interpretation of the Constitution to reflect the fact that our society has now caught up to a lot of our kind of leading philosophical minds.
Do you have a conceptualization of what that middle ground would look like? To pose one back at you? Yeah. Thank goodness, because if you had it and we didn't, I would be a little embarrassed.
You're gonna have to come up here.
So my question is mostly about this originalist thought. So, of course, if you were to take it to pure originalism, Article 3 does not give our Supreme Court that power. That, of course, comes in 1803 with Marbury v. Madison. And it's engraved into the walls that it says it is emphatically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. So in a way, the foundation of originalist interpretation in the Supreme Court is on a living document kind of ground, because Article 3 mostly explains the Supreme Court as a court of original jurisdiction for a lot of these different things that might arise of national importance. So I wonder, how does an originalist rectify this problem of, okay, all of these things that we're doing, we can have these strict originalist interpretations in an area where that is not originalist itself?
So, yeah, I think that's an excellent question. And I think that the answer would have to be the decision to pursue a written constitution at all. As a written constitution does give it the character of law that an unwritten constitution does not have. And so in a system where you have an unwritten constitution, the Supreme Court would never have the power of judicial review. That would be, nonsensical, right? It's the legislator that has this. But I think that, or at least Scalia's position is that once a written constitution is adopted, then this means that the Constitution adopts the character of contract in a way that is legally enforceable. Whereas a unwritten constitution is like contractual more in a very abstract social contract kind of way. So yeah, it's not a perfect answer, I grant you, but I think that is the originalist position, is that it is a necessary feature of the written constitution, is that you are then going to kind of relegate these questions about the conflict between laws to a judicial body.
I don't think Marshall sort of creates this whole cloth. There are places and times, including a few in the Federalist Papers, where there's talk of of the judiciary eventually doing some interpretation. I mean, again, you've got Madison sitting there in private letters saying, "I don't want to give you my notes on the convention because I don't want you to interpret." Right? I mean, so he's again sort of presupposing that sort of interpretation would take place as well.
But like when, say, Montesquieu argues for an independent judiciary, this is going to be one of the things that an originalist would draw from, because the fact of an independent judiciary was not necessary, right? Like it could be, that the judiciary is part of the executive branch, that the king is able to weigh in on judicial decisions, like in England, and so so again, this is why originalism is so difficult. Is it's not just the text of the document itself. You have to actually look at what is the prevailing understanding of constitutional, the Constitution as contract, and the proper role of the judiciary in a constitutional republic at this time, and that's a really hard thing to do. Oh, opening it up to online.
Unmute participant online, Ben. Ben, you're unmuted. You can unmute yourself here and ask your question. While he trying to unmute his. Ben probably trying to unmute his up. There you are, Ben.
Yes, can you hear me now? Hello, can you hear me now? Yes, I can.
Yes, you're good.
Thank you. All right. So first off, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you for your time. My question is about the Trump versus United States Supreme Court case last summer. I wanted y'all to both give your take on what the court's decision means. Does it really change how much power the president actually has? Do you think it's in line with your view of the Constitution? Because I know there's lots of, some say, oh, it's just kind of semantics, kind of rewording what was already in place. Others are saying that this is opening the door to dictatorship, and I wanted to hear y'all's opinion on it.
I don't think that is a decision that would have been decided that way in a living Constitution framework. And to be, I'm not going to put words in Kim's mouth, but I don't think it's a decision necessarily that gets decided that way in an originalist framework as well. Yeah. So yeah. I'm a bit at a loss on the method of legal interpretation that leads to that conclusion. I will say that.
I will agree with you. So yes, we
have reached consensus. The executive should not have unlimited power.
I say if there is one kind of true north to originalist interpretation, it's that the executive has to be restrained, right? Like that is the entire purpose of separating the judicial branch from the executive branch, is to restrain the executive. So if we're looking to what the framers intended, that's a fundamental principle, right? Is that the executive is dangerous and needs to be constrained as much as possible, without hampering our ability to organize national defense. So yeah, I am with you. I don't understand what framework they were using.
I have a couple more questions here from the online audience, but they've asked me to read them. So, the originalist has expressed checks and balances, Paul asks. Why didn't they contemplate bad faith actors within the constitutional framework and how to deal with them?
Bad faith actors, like bad faith elected officials?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, they did. They did. Drew, you have a more comprehensive answer.
Well, I think that, they do, in the sense that obviously this is when you look at our, it's a dual system, right? We have this quality of civic republicanism, which requires virtue amongst citizens and leaders, right? I think that in this sort of in the classical tradition, and I think you simultaneously have this liberal tradition, right? The classical liberal tradition, which is highly suspect of the capacity for our leaders and our citizens to have these great virtues, which is why you get institutional design, right? Which is why you get these frameworks of checks and balances. Those are specifically there to limit or to try to control the baser instincts of people. Now, I think that though in that combination, the founders, the framers, they think that you need to have both. That institutional protections cannot necessarily stop a bad faith actor. You rely on virtue, but you can make up for deficiencies of virtue with the institutions, with checks, with impeachment, with what have you. I think that the failures are when you have someone who's entirely deficient of virtue, and when the institution's checks collapse, that is a constitutional crisis. That is an existential crisis to the country. So I don't know that there is a solution other than for the institutions to get it together, and for, if this is an individual who's in the executive, Congress needs to reassert some power, use the impeachment process, or people need to get their act together in terms of their own virtue and realize that you're dealing with a bad actor, and at the next opportunity, electoral opportunity, vote that person out. But I do think that when you have the combination of the failure of individual virtue and institutions to check, that is a real constitutional crisis for which there is no guaranteed answer.
I completely agree with all of that. I think that, and again, not to be glib about this, but I do explain it to my students as the Constitution is like fairies and Peter Pan. It only has power because we all believe in it. And the second we stop believing in it, it stops having power. And the framers absolutely recognize this. They say we can design these institutions to be rigorous enough to withstand occasional bad actors, but if there is a kind of sustained series of bad actors in elected office, and moreover, if it's not just that they have lost a concern for virtue, if the people have lost a concern for virtue to the point where they are willing to repeatedly elect leaders that do not have a concern for virtue, well then, yeah, you're not going to be able to, to use Ben Franklin's words, you're not going to be able to keep your republic, right? Like the republic demands virtue on behalf of the citizens and elected leaders both. And by virtue, we mean, exactly what we've been talking about, like this kind of real care for considering justice and considering liberty and considering equality and what it means to be a good citizen. And, how do we design a society that is as just as possible while being fair? And, all of these kind of really big questions. It's not just the Supreme Court that needs to be thinking about these things. Everybody has to think about these things.
And care for others.
Yeah, care for others. Yeah.
Which is why I care for you.
I care
right?
for you too.
No, but in a real way, right? And I think this is where, at least part of the work that we do with the Cincinnati Center, the name we chose for a reason, right? His
alliteration.
And alliteration, Coastal Carolinas Cincinnati Center, right? But that, this is an individual who displays incredible virtue in allowing himself to be made dictator and then handing back that power after the crisis in the empire. But that the work that we're attempting to get at, or some of the goals that we think of education, are trying to highlight these values and highlight these virtues, because they are incredibly important. And I think at the time of the founding, there may have been institutions which were better suited and more trusted to impart that virtue. And I'm not sure that there are many places that are working on character development, moral foundation, moral formation, things like this, the work of creating or crafting the whole human being. And I do think that it is absolutely imperative that higher education take up that mantle to continue to create individuals who are not just workforce ready or trained, but these are complete individuals. These are human beings who are ready for like a real commitment to the idea that we're creating, citizens. I think that's a throwaway line, and I think it has been a throwaway line.
Not be a throwaway
right?
Line, though. Yeah.
But we're train the new generations. No, like then put your money where your mouth is and fund civic education programs like the Cincinnati Center.
I remind everyone the phone lines are open.
That's right.
Garrett has a question here, and I'll come back to. I think we have a couple more in house real quick, but just last. This question is regards to the framework of the living Constitution. We had the originalists with Paul. Now we have the living. Both concepts of fundamental parts of American political life and technology have vastly evolved since the ratification of the Constitution. One such example mentioned in this lecture was the use of the 14th Amendment to determine whether women were intended to be included under its provisions, as a consensus of who constitutes as an American citizen has clearly changed since 1789. More current examples that come to mind are modern methods of communication and expression as applied to the First Amendment and the evolution of firearms under the Second Amendment, and the digital technology and privacy rights under the Fourth Amendment. It seems as though this framework's aspects of constant change would lead to instability of our founding document. How could change with new technologies or new social consensuses on key topics and the ease of change to the foundational political documents would create inherent unstable political systems vulnerable to the wills of factions? So I guess in some key is, how do you get stability, like Madison says, of the document if you embrace a living Constitution framework?
Yeah, but I do think, for some of these things, the founders didn't know what TikTok was or what a wiretap is, but they didn't understand what an unreasonable search was. And I think we can, without a huge leap of radical re-understanding, say, is a search of an individual's phone a search of their papers? Absolutely it is, right?
Yeah.
And do we have to amend the Constitution and amend the Fourth Amendment to say, and your cell phones, right? Does, again, this is you talked about the Fourth Amendment, I think, in the question. A wiretap or a GPS track does not, or I would argue under an strict originalist interpretation, probably not qualify for a lot of these Fourth Amendment protections, because it's not involving a trespass onto property. I mean, it may be in the sense that you had to apply a tracker, a dot, or something, but not in the sense that you could tap a phone from a centralized location and not actually. It doesn't involve a trespass. It's not. I think
Or you've consented to allow Google to track you.
That's right, and yet that's totally out of bounds, right? And every time we sign over that information in a end user license agreement, Fourth Amendment protections out the door, right? So we can't even contemplate those anymore. But I do think that the idea of it's not a stretch, and it is not a radical re-envisioning to say that law enforcement being able to track your location or to listen in on your conversation is absolutely a search which would require a warrant. So in those senses, I think we're good. I do understand, and I am sensitive to the concerns, although I think this is where you need restraint, that you run the risk in the living constitutionalist framework of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. But I do want to sort of double down. My first step in my talk really was look at the text, right? Look at the historical record. I do think you are bound to a certain degree by precedent and things like that, and those are the guardrails, okay? But there is a serious concern for, I think, a roughshod use of the philosophy, and I have no response to that other than you're absolutely right. There's a risk there. I think that the risk of that is not as bad as the risk of letting injustices go on, because we don't have the democratic will to fix these things, and because the judiciary must remain silent lest we call a woman a person.
I think that's yes, and I think that this is where statute law is important, right? Because I think where there is clearly a reasonable answer, such as, yes, your cell phone is your papers. Sure, that we can have judicial interpretation. Yeah. Where it's less clear, like, just stick with your example of like whether a wiretap is a search or not, that is where you need statute law, right? Like, because I don't think we should amend the Constitution every time, as I said, every time there's a new technological development, just because, yeah, you'll get to be like Alabama. But I do think it is dangerous to let the court decide what is some of these questions. Whereas, especially if it is an issue that is going to primarily affect the people, we are the ones being wiretapped, then perhaps we should be the ones demanding that our legislator actually make a determination about whether or not wiretapping without a warrant is permissible or something like that. So I do think that's where statute law is the solution. And again, the fact that we don't have the democratic will to demand this is, in my opinion, a way bigger problem than a couple of justices thinking that the living constitutional model is correct, right? Like, that's a way bigger problem.
Yeah. So we agree again.
Yes, we agree.
As I wear 3 different wiretaps, my phone and my watch and my thing. I love my government.
Yeah.
Thank you for your great debate. I enjoyed it a lot. I have 2 questions, one for originalists and the other for like living constitutionalists. I think to some extent reinterpretation is unavoidable, like even for the amendments. I kept thinking about like Amendment 2, and then the interpretation about the Second Amendment has been changed, and then previously like focused more on the militia, but now it's more on the individual rights to bear arms. So what would be the answers by the originalist would say on that?
We should absolutely not ignore the militia part. Like, that is the actual text of the Constitution.
Yeah, so that's my first question. And then second one is that partly I think you guys already answer some of my questions, but like, how do we know that it's time to actually reflect some of the changes in the society? Like, I mean, obviously we have cell phone now, but then like, what's the principle and the threshold? Should it be like certain number of like court cases from the lower courts or a number of cases discussed in Supreme Court? So is there any kind of common ground or consensus when that should be, the changes of society should be reflected?
I think I'll agree with Kim. I think if I'm playing critic of originalism, I think that the McDonald and the Chicago, the firearms cases are massively hypocritical, that people who would purport to call themselves originalists would lop off half of the amendment and say, yeah, you can have whatever firearm you want. Like that's not what it meant, right? But that is the political outcome that those folks might have been invested in or in trying to get to. So I think that just shows that I think there's, and when we first talked about ideology, the living constitutionalist is not immune from criticisms of imparting personal policy preferences into decisions, right? I'm just saying, join me, right? Admit what you're doing. To the second question, I don't know that we know when it's time to elevate one of these things but I do think that there is a hint from the framers in these really high supermajority requirements, that it cannot be because of transient or passing fancies or passions or whatever, that we change the foundational contract, we change the foundational document when 2/3 of the Congress proposes and 3/4. That is a massive hurdle, and I think that the God bless them for taking it back, but the wisdom of repealing prohibition. Yeah, I mean, like bad choice, right? We made these decisions based on, I think, a passing fancy.
Not a passing fancy, I'd say, because the women's temperance movement has deep historical roots, but it was bad information, right? Like, it's the idea that prohibition will reduce domestic violence. Turns out, no, no, it does not. No fault divorce reduces domestic violence. But, and so once you figure out that the rationale behind the amendment is incorrect, undo it. But if we do that too much, the Constitution loses all meaning, because suddenly it's no better than any other kind of law. It can just be. Yeah.
You've got a public policy experiment that's making its way into foundational document. That's a mistake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that as to when it becomes time to actually attempt amendment, there does have to be genuine consensus, right? It cannot or should not be the case that we would attempt to amend the Constitution with like 51% support from the public, or even lower court rulings, I don't think offer any sort of the near level of consensus that we need. I think it does have to be laws, like our states passing state laws in great numbers. Is there widespread sustained public support for a change? And then also are other judges kind of weighing in on not a new interpretation, but say this is a change that is needed, right? So if there are all of those things, if there's genuine consensus, that's when the time is right to amend. And again, if we are fundamentally incapable of building this kind of consensus, then we're fundamentally incapable of being a democracy.
Yeah.
And that again is the ultimate problem.
There are a few areas where we have widespread public sentiment in favor, and simply not leaders who have the will to do it.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think to the first question we had, money in politics is one of those areas where you have overwhelming popular support, but these folks who are elected officials are not willing to turn off the spigot.
Yeah.
Or at least turn down the flow or something. It's a
Well,
fire hose right now.
We've come to that point where there's one last question, and then you guys will be off the hot seats, off the hot chairs here. So, Wes, you have the pleasure of asking our last question here.
Great, make it good.
Yeah.
So this is like kind of a niche question within what you all have been discussing. So with the Equal Rights Amendment specifically, just in your thoughts, right, both in terms of like a pragmatic and a living constitutional interpretation, and then as an originalist interpretation. I know at the very tail end of the Biden administration, there was all this talk about the National Archivist publishing the amendment because there had been this what they claimed an unconstitutional limit placed on the amendment when it went out to the states. And so that once a state had actually passed the amendment, the ERA, it was passed, right? You couldn't rescind that. I'm just curious what you all think about that.
What's the law thing?
Yeah.
Right. I don't think it's unconstitutional for them to have a sunset on the timeline for the ratification. That ratification timeline was extended a handful of times. Now, I do think you have a more interesting case of, can you rescind, right, a state's acceptance, a state's ratification of a proposal, right? I mean, we kind of fought a war about your ability to pick and choose what parts of the Constitution you pay attention to, or what parts of federal law you do. And once you've entered into that contract, is it a matter of there can be a rescission because the ratification was not yet complete, which might be a compelling argument, right? It's also, I think, on the basis of the first point, it's moot because the ratification window is closed. So if Illinois wants to ratify it, Tennessee wants to rescind their ratification, none of that makes any difference because the proposal itself is dead. And until Congress gets 2/3 together to repropose it, it's not going to happen. That's I am not a lawyer, right? Hashtag or whatever, like footnote. I am not but that is my reading, or my interpretation of the law would be that Congress was within its authority to place a limit, and that anything that happens after that limit is not, it doesn't matter. Tennessee rescinding it or not rescinding it, or Illinois ratifying it, or it doesn't. That's virtue signaling or something like that, right? They're just trying. Yeah, they're making a signal on that point of policy.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But it's a great example, right? It's a great example too, I think, of some of the things with our debate too, because there were folks in the 70s who thought this is redundant. You don't need it. Women are part of the 14th.
Yeah, Scalia makes his argument. He says, if we can just change what person means, then why in the world are we even talking about the ERA? Right. You only think you need the ERA if you think that the language matters, right? So
what? Yeah. So where are you? I mean, and it's hard to say, right? And yeah, we had this debate for a decade.
Yeah.
So that might be unsatisfying.
Well, please join me in thanking our guests.
Thank you for all of your hospitality.